Very long. My good friend from Colorado, Mr. Buck, thank you for your leadership on this special order tonight on this critical issue, one of the key responsibilities, if not the number one responsibility of the House of Representatives, to protect the fiscal and economic health of the country and the government at least, our ability to meet our obligations, our ability to fund our priorities, our ability to borrow when necessary, not to the degree that we do today, to borrow when necessary in times of crisis. But I just want to make a couple of key points, if I may. Before the pandemic hit, before the China virus reached our shores, our annual spending was about $4.4 trillion, $4.4 trillion. And spending this year is projected to be about $6.2 trillion. So an increase of $1.8 trillion, or about 40% over 4 years. Now, the most ambitious of the somewhat serious proposals in this majority body right now, I should say the majority conference, to deal with the spending or to cut spending this year in this Congress is to cut about $130 billion. That's the most ambitious of the, what I would say, serious in the sense that there's getting any traction within this Congress. In other words, to cut from a projected $1.6 trillion of non-mandatory discretionary spending to cut it to $1.47, $130 billion. Think about that $130 billion, which is the ambitious plan. That's the stretch goal. Represents less than 10% of the increase in spending from pre-COVID to today over 4 years. So we've grown our spending in the discretionary spending by $1.8 trillion in 4 years, and yet we're only projecting to cut it, or even suggesting to cut it by $130 billion. Said another way, we're on track this year to have a deficit this year of somewhere between $1.5 trillion and $2 trillion. 1.5 trillion and 2 trillion this year. Revenues are down, spending is up, and again, the most ambitious, the stretch goal of the somewhat serious plans in this Congress is to cut spending by $130 billion, less than 10% of the projected deficit. So if we got through the 1.47, we would still retain 90% of the projected deficit this year. And in addition to it crushing us from a fiscal future standpoint, it's unsustainable. As you know better than I, we're on track to hit some $53 trillion in national debt in 10 years if we don't have any new emergency, exceptional, special spending, but just on the current track. Unsustainable. Our friend from Arizona, Mr. Schweikert, talked about the interest on the debt and how that's growing, and it's just unsustainable. But even in the immediacy, the American people are getting crushed today by this spending. The massive inflation we haven't seen in 40 years, diminishing purchasing power by some 15, 16% on average over the last 2 years. So in other words, $1,000 2 years ago is worth $850 today. But it's even worse in the essentials. Groceries are up much higher. Everybody needs to buy groceries. Utility costs are much higher. Energy costs in terms of gasoline at the pump, which is probably the biggest factor that impacts senior citizens, low income, fixed income, middle income Americans, anything else. And then housing costs. Housing costs through the roof. So we got the inflation crushing the American people. And then how have we responded to the housing or to the inflationary costs? We're crushing them with the massive increase in interest rates. Historically utilized to combat a hot economy, to try to head off inflation, to cool the economy. That's the theory anyway. I've never really agreed with that theory, but that's the theory. But instead what we're doing, we've caused the inflation not from a hot economy. We've caused the inflation from the massive spending. And then what we're doing is this futile attempt to combat inflation by raising interest rates. We went from an average mortgage rate being about 3% a year ago to now 7%. That extra 4%, figure an average mortgage is $300,000 in today's prices. 4% of $300,000 is $12,000. Divide that by monthly. The average mortgage is $1,000 a month more than it was a year ago. That doesn't even account for the higher costs in housing, the utility costs, the energy costs, the grocery costs. all, again, as a result, or primarily as a result, of the massive spending that's just crushing the American people. It's crushing their purchasing power. It's crushing their ability for their kids or their grandkids to make a start, to buy a home, to establish themselves new in their young career. And it's a result of the disastrous policies by this administration. So I yield back to you, Mr. Buck. I thank you again for your leadership on this all-important issue and keeping the attention where it belongs.
Well, if I may, I'd love to ask you a couple questions.
No tough ones.
As a fellow deficit hawk, you've heard about the vacant buildings that the federal government owns. And I think the number, the most accurate number I've heard is 77,000 vacant or underutilized buildings that the federal government owns. 77,000. Now, there have been some estimates that it's a little bit lower than that, but anywhere in that range is absolutely incredible to me. It costs approximately $2 billion a year to just keep those vacant buildings up to speed, whether it's the electricity, the security, the lawn maintenance, what all those things, $2 billion a year. And we also spend billions of dollars to house federal employees in office buildings that are privately owned. Now, this has been going on for 10 years. The GAO has been reporting this to Congress. My question to my good friend, and I'm not accusing my good friend at all, but why doesn't Congress, now this is the worst part of it, the GAO, Government Accounting Office, is a congressional office. We pay for the reports to find out about the waste and then ignore the reports that we're paying for about how the executive branch wastes money. What's the answer?
Well, so we work for the American people. The GAO works for us, and by extension, the American people. So 77,000 buildings approximately, and as you mentioned, a couple of $1 billion a year to sustain those buildings, to maintenance those buildings, operate those buildings, maintain them, staff them, whatever it might be. What about the value of the $77 billion? Why wouldn't we sell those buildings and realize the revenue to the Treasury, not just the $2 billion a year of not having to maintain those buildings, but also, I mean, let's just say that the average value of that building is, what, $100,000? Let's be real conservative. Let's say it's $1 million. 77,000, what is that? $77 billion? $77 billion worth of assets if the average building was worth $1 million. If it's only worth $100,000 on average, that's $7.7 billion. That would be not much more than a rounding error, the way that we spend money in the trillions here. But yet when you take that over time, it ends up to be, a few billion here, a few billion there. Before long, you're talking about real money.
Wouldn't it be a great idea to tell the executive branch that when they get done selling 10% of these buildings, 20% of these buildings, they'll start seeing some funding again? I thank the speaker so much, and I yield back.